Okay, let's start our discussion on the building blocks of life. And like I said, there are four big types of macromolecules that make you. Okay, those are going to be carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Let's start with carbohydrates. There's going to be simple and complex carbohydrates. Okay, in animals, these carbohydrates are going to be our primary source of dietary energy. So energy, okay? And also there's another function for them. They're also going to serve for as raw material to make other types of organic compounds. Okay, so let's put it like this. The functions: one, primary source of energy, and two, material to make certain structures in our cells, for example. Okay, and that's in animals. In plants, okay, it's also going to be part of the building material for much of the body plant. Okay, we'll talk about that later on. Carbohydrates, mostly hydrophilic. That means they're able to mix with water. They're able to mix and be dissolved in water. And carbohydrate, the word says it, right? Carbo, carbon, hydrates for hydration, right? So carbohydrates are going to be made of three main elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So carbohydrates are made of what? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And usually they have this chemical formula in this kind of ratio when they want to have two hydrogens, okay, per carbon and oxygen atoms. Okay, so if we look at this diagram really quick, we see that carbohydrates, like I said, they're going to be two types. Okay, they're going to be simple carbohydrates and they're going to be complex carbohydrates. Okay, and the simple carbohydrates are going to be broken down into two parts, or two types of simple carbohydrates. We're going to have the monosaccharides. Mono means one unit. Okay, disaccharides, the other type of simple carbohydrates. Di means two. Two two monosaccharides together. Okay. And most of the most important monosaccharides are going to be glucose, fructose, and galactose. Okay. Fructose, you get to see a lot of this in your fruits, for example. Okay, they have a lot of fructose, and glucose is going to be kind of our big star. Okay, because this is kind of the main energy molecule. Okay, for ours, for animals, specifically also for humans, right? Glucose, as you will see in another chapter, we're going to be using glucose to transfer that energy into a molecule called ATP. And ATP is used for energy purposes. In terms of the saccharides, three main disaccharides are maltose, lactose, and sucrose. Okay, we'll talk more about those in a second. And then what happens when you bring a lot of monosaccharides together, you make a big chain of carbohydrates, then you make something called polysaccharides. So poly is going to be kind of the polymer, and we talked about this before, polymer, big chain of monomers, right? So if the monomer for carbohydrates is a monosaccharide, a polysaccharide is going to be a polymer, okay, of monomers, okay? Polysaccharides will be a bunch of monomers, a bunch of monosaccharides together. And the main polysaccharides that we'll talk about is be the starches, okay, fibers, and glycogen. And glycogen is going to be the polysaccharide or the polymer for humans, for animals. And we're going to be storing a lot of the energy, okay, in the form of glycogen. So monosaccharides, we also call them simple sugars. Simple sugars. They are going to be the monomers, okay, the subunits, okay, monomers of polysaccharides. So mono for one, like we said already, one. The monomers cannot be broken down into smaller sugars, okay. And the examples of monomers, we talk about glucose, okay, and we're going to be keep talking about glucose. It's going to be very, very important. remember, glucose is going to be an energy molecule. More about that in later chapters. Now, fructose is another monosaccharide. It's another monomer, okay? And fructose is usually found in fruit. Monosaccharides like glucose are the main fuels for cellular work because that energy is going to be extracted, put on another molecule called ATP, and that's what we use to do our for cells to do what cells need to do, right? Transportation purposes, building up new cells for growth, etc. This is just an example that some sugars can be in linear form or they can be in ring structures. This means that they can switch from linear to ring structures. Usually we talk about a glucose molecule. We usually see it like this when it's in our system. Okay. And we also, this is going to be the example of two different monosaccharides, glucose and fructose. Now, they're isomers. What's an isomer? It's a molecule with the same formula, okay, but they have different arrangements. And look at the arrangement, look at the difference. What makes the difference between a glucose and a fructose molecule? It's all in this part. That is what makes it a little bit different, okay? Look where the OH group is over here, where is this the carbon with a double bond oxygen over here, and it kind of flips in fructose. Okay, that's what's make the difference between one monosaccharide and another, between glucose and fructose. Now you don't really need to know this, but just know how sometimes you can have the same formula, okay, but a different rearrangement. Okay, and that can mean that we have two slightly different molecules. So those are going to be the monomers, okay? Mono for one cannot be broken apart, and the main monosaccharide that we'll talk about is going to be glucose. And if we bring a bunch of glucose molecules together, okay, a bunch of monomers together, we are going to build up a polymer. Disaccharides, another type of simple sugars or simple carbohydrates. Now, di means two, right? So what happens is a disaccharide is nothing but two monosaccharides joined together via dehydration reactions, okay? Via a dehydration reaction. And if we look over here, okay, we see that a monomer, glucose, galactose, which is another monomer, they come together via dehydration reaction. Dehydration means we lose water molecule, as you can see here. And when we remove this water molecule, what do we make? We make a covalent bond, just like in our previous examples. Okay, remember I was talking about these two different reactions? Same thing. We use a hydration reaction, take water out, make a covalent bond, and what do we get if we put glucose and galactose together? We make something called lactose, and lactose is a disaccharide. And lactose is a sugar in your milk. And I'm going to do a little detour really quick. Lactose is a sugar that not everybody can break apart, right? So there's another macromolecule called proteins. Some proteins are enzymes. And there's an enzyme called lactase. And if you have the enzyme lactase, then you're able to break glucose. No, so you're able to break lactose. And you can break them apart into glucose and galactose. But some people are lactose intolerant. That means that they don't have that enzyme, lactase, so they're not able to break apart lactose. Okay, and that's the reason why many people can't drink milk or anything dairy, because they don't have an enzyme called lactase that is able to break down lactose into its two monosaccharides. So again, disaccharides. Disaccharide means two sugars together, two monomers together, two monosaccharides together. Okay, milk Lactose in milk is an example of a disaccharide. Maltose, which you can find in maltose beer and malted milkshakes, which is glucose and glucose together. And sucrose, what you put into your coffee, right? So it can taste more tolerable. Sucrose is also a disaccharide. It's sucrose is a combination between a glucose molecule and a fructose monomer. A glucose monomer and a fructose monomer. The bond between two monomers together to make a disaccharide is called a glycosidic linkage. Okay, and that's what it is over here. So we don't call it the special name for that covalent bond will be a glycosidic linkage. Glycosidic linkages, you only see them in carbohydrates. Okay, you only see them when we bring two monomers together. And then finally, polysaccharides. Poly means many, right? Polysaccharides, these are going to be our complex carbohydrates. These are going to be the polymers. What is a polymer? A polymer is a chain of monomers, right? If the monomer is a glucose molecule, you bring a lot of glucose molecules together, okay? You put them together chain, then you get some kind of a polysaccharide. So what are polysaccharides? They are polymers of monosaccharides. They're long chains of sugars. Examples of polysaccharides: starch. Okay, starch is what you eat in order to get some energy. It's in potatoes, for example. It's in your pasta. So starch, okay, is made of glucose molecules. So a bunch of glucose together, okay, you make starch. Now remember, glucose is a monosaccharide. So you put a monosaccharides together, okay, you make a chain of sugars. That chain of sugars is going to be a polysaccharide. Another polysaccharide is going to be glycogen. Okay, again, it's going to be made of a bunch of glucose molecules. Glycogen is particularly important for animals because this is how we store our energy. This is how we store our glucose. Okay, where do you find the glycogen? You find glycogen in our liver cells and our muscle cells. Okay, and then whenever you need some glucose, you need some energy, what's going to happen is you're going to be breaking down glycogen, okay, and you're going to be releasing glucose, okay, especially when you need energy. Cellulose is another polysaccharide. Again, it's going to be made of glucose molecules. Cellulose is the most abundant organic compound on Earth. Now, cellulose, you're going to see that a lot in plants. Okay, cellulose is going to become rigid. Okay, it's a very rigid, very strong type of polysaccharide. Okay, and it's going to be the main component of plant cells. So that's something I want you to know. Plant cells are going to have something called a cell wall. Okay, and the cell wall of plants is going to be made of, guess what? Cellulose. Because cellulose is so rigid and so strong, it cannot be broken down by animal enzymes. That is why you cannot eat a lot of you cannot break down cellulose. Okay, it's eventually be part of your fiber component of your diet. Okay, because you cannot break it apart. Now, some animals are able to eat plant material, right? Like for example, cows. Some of them are able to break it apart, but the reason why some animals are able to break apart the cellulose is because they have some kind of bacteria in their gut that breaks apart cellulose. So they really cannot break it apart either, but they have bacteria that can do it for them. Okay. In our case, because we cannot break apart cellulose because it's so hard, and I'll show you in a little bit why. I'll show you the structure of cellulose, and I'll show you why it's so hard to break apart. Because of that, for us, cellulose is gonna be kind of our source of fiber. Okay, it's gonna be insoluble. We cannot really break it apart. It's our fiber, so it's gonna help move our food down our digestive tract. Another Another polysaccharide is chitin. Okay, and chitin is also going to be very rigid, also for structure, also for strength. Most of the times, it's used to make the cell walls of fungi. Okay, and also it's going to be used to make external skeletons of insects. So if you ever see an insect and you ever try to smash an insect, you see kind of cracks, right? It's because it's very, very strong and it's made of chitin. Okay, so remember polysaccharides. The first thing you need to remember about polysaccharides is there are polymers. They're made big chain. It's a big chain made of monomers. A lot of the times, these monomers are going to glucose. Okay, so you put a lot of monomers together, you make a polymer. The polymer in this case is going to be for carbohydrates are polysaccharides, and there's different types of polysaccharides. We have starch, which is a great source of energy. Okay, you can break it apart. You can break apart starch and to get glucose. Okay, so you can actually use it for energy purposes. Starch is found in plants, found in plant material. Glycogen is going to be also made of glucose molecules, but that's going to be that is animal, that is for animals, so we can store our excess glucose. Cellulose is also made of glucose, and cellulose is also a polysaccharide. And cellulose is very rigid, is very strong, it's very hard to break, and that's going to be making the cell walls of plants. And then finally, chitin. Chitin is also another polysaccharide. Chitin is very, very strong, very rigid, and it makes the cell walls of fungi and also the external skeletons of a lot of insects. And this is just a picture of starch, which you find in, for example, potatoes, starch, and this is glycogen, which you find in animals, and this is cellulose, which you find again in plants. Okay, in the plant, in the cell walls of plants. Okay, so starch. Can you break apart starch? Can you, when you eat potatoes, can you break it apart? The answer is yes. Okay, so starch is also a storage molecule, storage of energy because it has a lot of glucose. Okay, now this one you can break apart. You eat it, you have the enzymes to break it apart, and when you break it apart, you can break apart and you get a lot of glucose, right? Because this is a glucose molecule. So imagine you breaking it apart, you break it apart, you break it apart, okay? And you get a lot of glucose molecules available for you to use in terms of energy. Glycogen, let's say you have a lot of glucose in your body. You don't need it at that time, okay? So you store it and you store it as a form of glycogen. Now, look at glycogen. Look at the way it's branched. You see how we have kind of a string here and then slowly just branches out, and then it branches out here as well. Okay. So there's a lot of branching in glycogen, and that is good because that allows surface area. It increases the surface area. It makes it available for enzymes to break it apart. Okay. But if you had too much glucose in your body, what's going to happen is that your body is going to bring that glucose into your cells, and your cells are going to kind of sticking, okay, sticking these monomers together, these glucose molecules together into long chains, okay, into a long polysaccharides called glycogen. And then finally, cellulose. Now, cellulose, I told you, is very, very rigid. It's very, very strong. The reason why is because not only you have these chains of glucose molecules, but also there's a lot of hydrogen bonding here. Okay, so technically you're making it so strong that it's very difficult for enzymes to go in and break apart cellulose. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so that is our section with carbohydrates. Remember what a monomer is, remember what a disaccharide is, remember what a polysaccharide is, and remember the different types of monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides involved in biological processes.